The city was a living organism, pulsing with noise, ambition, and danger. The 1930s had turned New York into a concrete jungle where power was traded like currency and silence could mean survival. The docks reeked of salt and sweat, the speakeasies buzzed with jazz and whispers, and in the dim back rooms of Manhattan, a new kind of ruler was rising, one who didn't need a throne, crown, or army. He needed only fear. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano, and he would build an empire not on faith or loyalty, but on psychology, the ability to understand men's weaknesses, their desires, and their terror of losing everything. The story begins not with a gunshot, but with an idea. Luciano understood something most gangsters of his time didn't: chaos was inefficient. Violence could control a block, but structure could control a nation. He wasn't interested in being another thug with a reputation. He wanted to be a statesman of crime, a man who could manage murder the way a banker manages capital. That mindset, cold and analytical, would change the very foundation of organized crime in America. In a smoky room of the Waldorf Astoria, power moved like perfume, unseen but intoxicating. Politicians shook hands with mobsters, judges dined with the very men they would later condemn, and every favor had a price. Luciano sat quietly among them, observing, speaking little. His silence wasn't humility, it was calculation. He understood that in a room full of loud men, the quiet one becomes the most dangerous. His eyes read people like open ledgers. Who owed who? Who feared who? Who could be bought, and who needed to disappear? But to understand Lucky Luciano, you have to understand the psychology of power in his world. The mafia wasn't just a criminal network, it was a mirror of human nature, greed, loyalty, pride, and the deep desire for control. Luciano mastered the art of balance. He was ruthless enough to inspire fear, but charming enough to inspire trust. To him, murder was a tool, not an impulse. Intimidation was theater, not chaos. Every act of violence served a purpose, and every show of generosity was a trap disguised as friendship. On the streets of New York, children whispered his name the way others whispered about heroes. Lucky wasn't just about survival from an attack or a near-death experience, it was the aura he cultivated. He projected inevitability. To cross him was to challenge the laws of destiny itself. Fear of him wasn't just physical, it was existential. He made people believe that their fate was tied to his will, that their survival depended on his approval. That illusion of control became the cornerstone of his empire. The city itself seemed to bend around his influence. From the garment district to the docks, from Harlem to Hell's Kitchen, money flowed through invisible veins that all led back to him. The police were outnumbered, not by men, but by motives. Corruption ran so deep that even the law worked unknowingly for him. He had transformed crime from a street affair into a corporate system. But behind the operations, there was something far more fascinating: his mind. Luciano understood fear the way artists understand color. He knew how to mix it, how to shade it, how to make it both subtle and overwhelming. At night, when the city went quiet, he would stand at his window overlooking the lights. Somewhere below, men were dying for his orders, while others were making fortunes because of his protection. He controlled both sides of morality, both heaven and hell. And yet, in that silence, he often felt something else, a growing emptiness that power could not fill. Fear ruled others, but it also imprisoned him. Every ally was a potential traitor. Every smile could hide a knife. The empire built from fear demanded that he live inside it too. The world would later call him a criminal genius, but what he truly was a psychological engineer. He built systems of control, networks of dependency, and rituals of silence that outlived him by decades. His influence would echo in every organized crime family that came after. But in the beginning, he was simply a man with a vision: to make crime efficient, to make fear profitable, and to turn the chaos of the underworld into order. This was not the story of a gangster. This was the story of a man who studied power the way a priest studies scripture. He didn't just live in the shadows, he designed them. And as America entered the era of corruption and opportunity, Lucky Luciano stood at the crossroads of morality and ambition, a man who understood that in a world built on fear, the calmest mind becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. New York at the turn of the century was not the dazzling metropolis that would later define the American dream, it was a battlefield dressed as a city. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and desperation. Immigrant families poured into the Lower East Side, living in cramped tenements where disease and poverty were as common as the sound of trolley bells. Men worked 12-hour shifts for pennies, women sewed until their fingers bled, and children learned early that the only way to survive was to take what wasn't given. In the shadows of progress, crime became a language, a form of survival as legitimate as any honest trade. The city's underbelly was divided along ethnic lines. Italians ruled Mulberry Street, Jews dominated the garment factories, the Irish policed both the streets and the politics. Turf wars weren't fought over ideology, they were fought over bread, over dignity, over the illusion of control. It was a world without fairness, where authority was corrupt and justice was for sale. Every alleyway had its own ruler, and every block its own law. Violence was both punishment and proof of existence. To be feared was to be respected. To be respected was to live another day. The police, overwhelmed and underpaid, often became part of the same machinery they were meant to dismantle. Bribes passed like secret handshakes. Judges were bought with the same ease as liquor during Prohibition. Beneath the city's modern face, a primitive economy thrived, one built on extortion, theft, and manipulation. For the poor, morality was a luxury. Hunger had its own code, and every boy who ran messages or guarded a gambling den understood one truth: power wasn't inherited, it was earned through fear. This was the world that shaped Charles Luciano. He was still Salvatore Lucania then, a small boy from Lercara Fritti, Sicily, brought to America with his family in search of a better life. But what he found was chaos disguised as opportunity. His father labored on construction sites, his mother mended clothes, yet the young boy quickly realized that hard work led only to exhaustion, not power. The streets taught him faster lessons: how to read danger in a man's eyes, how to detect weakness in his voice, and how to survive by instinct rather than innocence. In the crowded markets and dim saloons, Luciano watched the hierarchy of fear unfold daily. The toughest men controlled the weak not through constant violence, but through reputation. Stories spread faster than bullets, and a single whisper could elevate a petty criminal into a figure of myth. Fear, he noticed, was contagious. It spread from man to man, neighborhood to neighborhood, until it became a kind of invisible government. Even as a child, he absorbed this truth like scripture: control perception, and you control people. New York before Luciano's rise was a city without a crown, a realm of competing tyrants. The 5 Points gangs, the Bowery Boys, the Eastman Gang, and the 5 families that would later emerge were still disorganized, driven more by ego than by vision. Each gang leader saw himself as a king, but none realized they were all fighting for fragments of a broken kingdom. There was no structure, no coordination, no sense of empire, just a storm of greed and violence. And in every storm, someone eventually learns how to control the wind. Luciano grew up watching these men destroy each other, not out of necessity, but pride. To him, it was wasteful. The endless killings, the reckless rivalries, it was bad business. Even as a teenager, he began to think differently. He saw opportunity in uniting what others wanted to divide. If the gangs could be organized like corporations, if rules could replace chaos, the entire city could operate under one invisible hand. It was a thought years ahead of its time, and it began as a quiet realization in a boy who understood that fear, when disciplined, could become power. The Italian immigrants brought with them the shadow of the old world, the code of omerta, the idea that silence was strength, and betrayal was worse than death. But America changed that equation. Here, survival demanded adaptation. The old codes had to evolve or die. Luciano stood at the intersection of two worlds, the Sicilian tradition of loyalty and the American obsession with profit. He would blend both, creating something entirely new, a criminal structure that mimicked capitalism itself. By the 1910s, prohibition was on the horizon, and the city was ready to explode. Illegal liquor would soon become the bloodstream of corruption, fueling fortunes for anyone bold enough to claim it. The Irish controlled the ports, the Jews managed the distribution, and the Italians, once seen as unorganized, began to rise. Luciano was watching closely, studying not just the men in power but the systems they used. He didn't need to be the loudest or the strongest, he needed to be the smartest. Beneath the roar of trains and the rattle of horse-drawn carts, a new kind of ambition was forming in him. He didn't dream of escape from poverty, he dreamed of mastering it. Where others saw violence as an end, he saw it as a means. Where others sought glory, he sought efficiency. The city's chaos became his education, its criminals his professors. And though he was still just another face in the crowded streets of Manhattan, something in his eyes had already changed. He was no longer observing fear. He was learning how to manufacture it. By the time the rest of New York realized what was happening, the foundations of Luciano's future empire were already being laid. The city that had once swallowed immigrants whole had, in turn, created its own monster, a man shaped by its hunger, trained by its cruelty, and destined to rule it from within. New York before Lucky Luciano was a city built on chaos. After him, it would be built on order, the order of fear. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in a small Sicilian village called Lercara Fritti, a place where poverty was inherited like a family heirloom and survival was an art. His father, Antonio, was a simple man who believed that honest work could lift a family from struggle. But Sicily at the turn of the century offered little but dust and superstition. For the Lucania family, the dream of America glimmered across the ocean, a promise of freedom, dignity, and prosperity. They boarded a ship to New York when Salvatore was only 9 years old. But the new world they found was not the shining land of opportunity. It was a jungle made of concrete, ruled by men who understood that decency was a weakness. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was their new home, a maze of narrow streets, rotting tenements, and restless souls. Here, the Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants lived stacked on top of one another like forgotten cargo. Every window screamed with life and hunger. The streets taught faster than any school. Children learned to fight before they could spell. For young Salvatore, this was not tragedy, it was training. He learned that fear could keep you alive, that respect was not given, and that violence, when calculated, was a form of persuasion. He was small for his age but fearless. Other boys bullied him at first, calling him Sal the Wop, mocking his accent, his clothes, his poverty. But Salvatore was observant. He noticed how the bullies gained their confidence from the crowds. So, he waited, watched, and struck back when no one was looking. One by one, he made examples of them. He didn't just want to fight, he wanted to send a message. Fear, he realized, worked better when it was earned in silence. As he grew older, his circle of friends began to include boys who would later become legends in their own right: Meyer Lansky, the mathematical mind of Jewish descent, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the reckless firebrand, and Frank Costello, the silver-tongued diplomat of the underworld. They were children of the same streets, molded by the same hunger. Together they formed a fraternity of ambition, a brotherhood of outsiders who understood that the system was never built for men like them. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to rewrite the rules. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano had dropped out of school. Books couldn't teach him what he needed to know. The real lessons came from the streets, from the gangsters who ruled the neighborhoods and the businessmen who pretended not to see. He started running errands for petty criminals, collecting protection money, and selling dope to dockworkers. Each job, no matter how small, was another piece in his self-education. He studied people, their habits, fears, and thresholds. He learned when to intimidate and when to charm. Even at 16, he had the poise of a man twice his age. In those years, Luciano experienced his first taste of real danger. He was mugged by a group of men one night and brutally beaten. They left him for dead in the gutter, his face slashed and his throat nearly cut. But he survived. The newspapers later called it a miracle. He called it destiny. From that day, the streets began calling him Lucky. The name stuck, not just as a token of fortune but as a badge of invincibility. In the world he was entering, reputation mattered more than truth. Lucky Luciano was not just a man, it was an idea, a myth that fear itself couldn't kill. His near-death experience changed him in ways even he couldn't articulate. It stripped away the last traces of boyhood and replaced them with purpose. He began to see violence differently, not as random or emotional, but as a calculated instrument. Fear, when used correctly, could bend people without breaking them. He learned to look a man in the eyes and make him believe that defiance would cost him everything. Yet, he also learned the value of appearing calm, collected, even generous. This balance between charm and cruelty would later make him the most effective leader the underworld had ever seen. In the 1920s, the streets of New York were changing fast. Prohibition had turned alcohol into gold. Everyone wanted a piece of the black market, from street punks to politicians. Luciano began working under Joe, the boss, Masuria, one of the most powerful mafia leaders in the city. Masuria was old-school Sicilian, suspicious, arrogant, and resistant to change. But Luciano saw opportunity in his outdated methods. While his boss ruled through intimidation, Luciano believed in structure, alliances, and profit-sharing. He wanted to turn crime into business, chaos into organization. During these years, Luciano's relationship with Meyer Lansky deepened. The two complemented each other like opposite halves of the same brain, Luciano the strategist, Lansky the tactician. Together, they began building a network that transcended ethnicity. Italians, Jews, and Irishmen who would have once killed each other were now sitting at the same table, counting the same money. Luciano understood that prejudice was bad for business. What mattered wasn't where a man came from, but what he could deliver. This mindset, so radical for the time, was the seed of what would become the American Mafia's modern structure. Luciano's influence continued to grow quietly. He wasn't yet the king, but he was already the architect. He made himself indispensable, negotiating truces, managing rackets, ensuring that money flowed smoothly across territories. His calm demeanor and sharp intelligence earned him the respect of both allies and enemies. And in the back of his mind, he was already envisioning something larger, an empire where fear wasn't just a weapon, it was policy. But the making of Lucky wasn't complete without one more transformation, the psychological one. The near-death experience had given him not just courage but detachment. He no longer reacted, he calculated. He learned to suppress emotions, to see betrayal as inevitable and loyalty as temporary. He began to live by an unspoken creed: trust no one completely, control everything quietly. Every gesture, every glance, every word became a tool in his psychological arsenal. By his early 20s, Lucky Luciano was no longer the poor Sicilian boy from Lurkera Fritti. He had become the prototype of a new kind of gangster, the kind who didn't need to pull the trigger to win a war. He understood that the most powerful man in any room was not the one who shouted the loudest, but the one who made everyone else lower their voices. His empire had not yet been built, but the man who would build it had been fully formed. The streets had raised him, fear had shaped him, and ambition had defined him. Lucky Luciano was ready to step out of the shadows, not as another name in the long list of gangsters, but as the man who would give organized crime its mind, its system, and its soul. The making of Lucky was complete. What came next would redefine power forever. The 1920s were roaring, but beneath the jazz and champagne, America was a pressure cooker ready to blow. Prohibition had outlawed alcohol, and in doing so, had birthed a new kind of gold rush, one where liquor flowed through back alleys instead of factories, and fortunes were made not by industry, but by crime. In this chaos, Lucky Luciano saw clarity. While others saw opportunity, he saw infrastructure. He understood that chaos could not last forever, that the violence tearing through the city was unsustainable. If he could bring order to the underworld, if he could unite killers and businessmen under one philosophy, he could become not just powerful, but untouchable. New York's criminal world at the time was fractured. Joe, the boss, Masuria ruled one side, and Salvatore Maranzano ruled the other. The Castellamarese War, a brutal internal conflict among Sicilian gangs, was tearing the mafia apart from within. Blood ran in the streets, and loyalty shifted like the tides. Men killed for flags that changed color overnight. For Luciano, it was all a waste. He was a student of efficiency. Where others saw honor, he saw obstruction. The old guard still clung to their Sicilian traditions, swearing allegiance to outdated hierarchies that limited their reach. Luciano wanted something new, a criminal system modeled after modern business, run with logic instead of pride. It was in these years that he began to assemble the foundation of what would later be known as the National Crime Syndicate. His closest allies, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, became the architects of this new order. They weren't bound by ethnicity or old-world codes, they were bound by ambition. Each brought a skill set that would define the organization. Lansky had the mind of a banker, Costello the charm of a politician, and Siegel the fury of a soldier. Luciano's genius was in how he bound them together. He didn't lead through domination, but through persuasion. He made his men believe that by serving him, they were serving themselves. The Prohibition era was their golden opportunity. Liquor was illegal, but demand was endless. Luciano saw the potential to turn street crime into enterprise. Instead of controlling a few speakeasies, he envisioned a system where supply chains were mapped, territories were negotiated, and profits were distributed systematically. He and Lansky built networks with Canadian suppliers, smuggling operations from Havana, and distribution routes across the eastern seaboard. Each deal, each bribe, each truckload of liquor brought him closer to his ultimate vision, a mafia that functioned like a multinational corporation. Luciano's partnerships extended beyond his Italian roots. He collaborated with Jewish and Irish mobsters, an unheard-of move at the time. Where others saw rivals, he saw shareholders. He met with Arnold Rothstein, the brain of the underworld, who became an early mentor figure. Rothstein taught Luciano how to manage risk, how to calculate profit margins, and, most importantly, how to make crime respectable. Violence is bad for business, Rothstein once told him. Luciano absorbed that lesson like gospel. Control through stability, not chaos, that became his creed. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Luciano inherited not just his contacts, but his philosophy. Still, to reshape the mafia, Luciano had to deal with the old rulers. Joe Masuria, his boss, was a tyrant from another era, greedy, paranoid, and blind to progress. Luciano had once sworn loyalty to him, but loyalty meant little in a war that destroyed profit. When Masuria's lust for power began costing lives and money, Luciano made his most ruthless decision yet, to orchestrate his own boss's downfall. It was a betrayal that would change history. The scene was cinematic. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masuria to a lunch at Coney Island's Nuova Villa Tomorrow restaurant. They dined, laughed, played cards. When Luciano excused himself to the restroom, the killers, Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, entered. Within seconds, the old boss lay dead, riddled with bullets and left with a cigar still burning in his hand. Luciano returned, glanced at the lifeless body, and simply said, "It had to be done." In that moment, a new era began. But the war wasn't over yet. Maranzano, Masuria's rival, now stood as the last obstacle. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, believing he could control Luciano the same way he had manipulated others. It was a fatal miscalculation. Luciano smiled, obeyed, and learned. For months, he studied Maranzano's structure, his routines, his weaknesses, his ego. Then he struck with precision. On September 10, 1931, Luciano sent a team disguised as government agents into Maranzano's office. They arrived with badges, pulled their guns, and eliminated the final relic of the old world. The modern mafia was born that day. With both rivals gone, Luciano stepped into the void, not as a self-proclaimed ruler, but as an organizer. He abolished the title of boss of all bosses, believing absolute power only bred instability. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing body composed of leaders from the major families. Every major decision, from territories to murders, would be approved collectively. It was a political system masquerading as crime management. For the first time, the mafia had balance, predictability, and accountability. Luciano had turned gang warfare into government. The commission included representatives from all key families, the Genovese, the Gambino, the Lucchese, the Bonanno, and the Colombo families. Each family controlled its own business, but all answered to the syndicate. It was democracy for criminals, a revolutionary idea that merged the Sicilian code with American capitalism. Luciano's goal wasn't domination, it was sustainability. He understood that power didn't need to be visible to be absolute. Behind this new order, Luciano's psychological brilliance was unmatched. He knew how to read men better than any psychiatrist. He could sense disloyalty before it manifested, sniff out fear before it was spoken. His calm demeanor made him unpredictable. When he smiled, men relaxed, when he stayed silent, they panicked. He cultivated an aura that kept everyone uncertain but obedient. He didn't rule with the whip, he ruled with anticipation. In public, Luciano appeared as a gentleman, tailored suits, polished shoes, a quiet confidence that made him welcome among New York's elite. He was photographed with politicians, seen dining in fine restaurants, and rumored to have judges on his payroll. To the press, he was the modern mobster, sophisticated and intelligent. But beneath that charm was the same ruthless boy from the Lower East Side, now armed with structure, influence, and an army of men willing to die for him. The National Crime Syndicate became a network stretching from coast to coast. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, every industry had a share, every family had a cut. Even Hollywood wasn't untouched. Luciano's reach extended into unions, construction, and politics. He was no longer just a gangster, he was an institution. His creation had turned the mafia into an economic system parallel to the legitimate one, and his use of fear as an organizational principle was pure genius. By the early 1930s, the old world of gang lords and assassins had been replaced by something colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The mafia no longer fought over corners, it managed markets. Fear had been corporatized. Luciano's syndicate was invisible, efficient, and terrifyingly organized. He had taken a disordered brotherhood of thugs and forged it into a council of kings. It was the perfect machine, profitable, disciplined, and loyal only to success. Yet in building this empire of order, Luciano had also planted the seed of his own downfall. Because in a system where everyone shared power, betrayal didn't come from enemies, it came from friends. But for now, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no one before him dared to imagine. He had built an empire from fear and made the underworld run on logic. The streets were no longer ruled by chaos, they were ruled by him. The world Luciano built needed rules, rules more powerful than law, more sacred than religion. His empire wasn't just held together by profit, it was bound by psychology. At its core was a single principle older than any government or institution: fear. Not the chaotic kind that sparked riots and paranoia, but the engineered kind that commanded loyalty and obedience. To maintain it, Luciano relied on a code inherited from his ancestors, the omerta. In Sicily, it was a survival mechanism. In America, Luciano turned it into a weapon of governance. Omerta meant silence. It meant the refusal to cooperate with the police, the press, or any authority outside the family. It meant that a man's word mattered more than any written law. Breaking that silence wasn't just betrayal, it was spiritual suicide. The penalty was death, not only for the traitor but for anyone connected to him. Under Luciano, omerta became the constitution of the underworld. It created a psychological hierarchy where loyalty was absolute and fear became the invisible currency that kept the system running. To the outside world, the mafia seemed like a network of gangsters. But inside, it was a society of ritual and symbolism. Each initiation was a psychological transformation. The ceremony was simple but profound. A saint's picture burned in the initiate's hand as he swore eternal loyalty to the family, promising to prefer death over betrayal. The pain of the flame was meant to etch the promise into his soul. When the flame went out, he was reborn, not as a man, but as property. To disobey the family was to cease to exist. Luciano understood the value of that ritual. It wasn't superstition, it was conditioning. It turned fear into faith. Luciano mastered the language of fear like an artist mastering light and shadow. He rarely raised his voice, never lost his composure, and seldom threatened openly. Instead, he let silence do the work. When he entered a room, conversations stopped, not because he demanded it, but because everyone anticipated what he might say. The anticipation itself became the punishment. He could look at a man and make him confess without speaking a word. This psychological control was what separated Luciano from the brutish dons who came before him. He didn't need to display power, he made others imagine it. Every family under the commission operated by this code. Disobedience wasn't met with chaos, it was met with precision. Luciano had designed an ecosystem of consequences. If a soldier stole from the family, he disappeared quietly, often by the hands of his closest friend. If a capo questioned orders, his business burned the next morning. There were no public executions, no warnings. The fear of the unknown was far more effective than spectacle. Men didn't fear death, they feared the moment before it, the silence in the air when the phone rang late at night, or the knock on the door that never came. Luciano's version of omerta extended beyond the mafia itself. He weaponized it against the outside world. Politicians, judges, and police officers all became part of his network of silence, each paid to look the other way. He knew that money could buy loyalty, but fear could preserve it. A politician might take a bribe once, but if he feared exposure, or worse, he would remain obedient for life. Luciano blurred the line between crime and governance. The same principles that held his soldiers together now bound public officials in invisible chains. Inside the organization, trust was a myth. Every man trusted only the system of fear that Luciano had built. And yet, paradoxically, that system created stability. Men who feared betrayal were too cautious to commit it. It was a paradox of power, fear created loyalty, and loyalty created profit. Luciano understood this balance intuitively. He once said to a lieutenant, "If they love you, they might betray you. If they fear you, they never will." The code of silence was more than just a rule, it was culture. Wives didn't ask where their husbands went at night. Mothers didn't question missing sons. Priests knew when to stop listening during confession. The mafia's greatest weapon wasn't its guns, it was its invisibility. The police could never catch what no one would speak about. Reporters could only print rumors because no one dared to confirm them. In this silence, Luciano's empire thrived like a ghost government, unseen but omnipresent. Psychologically, omerta operated like a virus. Once inside, it rewired the mind. Men began to self-censor, to internalize obedience until it became instinct. Luciano encouraged this conditioning subtly. He rewarded loyalty with luxury, new suits, money, respect, and punished betrayal with absence. A man who disobeyed wasn't simply killed, his memory was erased. His name wasn't spoken again, his photograph vanished, his family shunned. To defy Luciano was not just to die, but to be forgotten. Oblivion was the ultimate punishment, and every soldier feared it more than bullets. There were moments when Luciano himself reflected on the code. In private conversations, He admitted to Lansky that omerta was both his strength and his curse. It gave him order, but it also built walls around him. He couldn't fully trust anyone, not his friends, not his lovers, not even his own shadow. Fear keeps them close, he once said quietly, but it keeps me alone. In those rare moments of honesty, the architect of the underworld sounded less like a tyrant and more like a philosopher imprisoned by his own design. Still, he never abandoned the code. He couldn't afford to. The very existence of his empire depended on it. He knew that once men started talking, everything would crumble. The government could raid warehouses, arrest soldiers, confiscate cash, but silence was indestructible. It was his armor. Every detective who interrogated his men ran into the same wall, blank stares, tight lips, and unshakable calm. Even under torture, even when facing the electric chair, his soldiers stayed silent. They weren't heroes. They were believers. By the mid-1930s, omerta had become so deeply ingrained in Luciano's empire that it reached mythic proportions. The FBI called it a wall of silence, but that phrase didn't capture its essence. It wasn't just silence, it was devotion. It turned killers into monks, extortionists into loyal bureaucrats, and fear into faith. It was the spiritual foundation of organized crime. And at its center stood Lucky Luciano, the silent architect who proved that the most powerful weapon a man could wield wasn't the gun in his hand, but the silence he commanded. In this world, words could kill faster than bullets. To speak was to betray, and to betray was to vanish. Luciano had built something extraordinary, not just an organization, but a psychological fortress. It was his masterpiece, his invisible empire of silence, and it would endure long after his voice was gone. Omerta wasn't just the mafia's code. Under Luciano, it became a religion of fear, one that worshipped loyalty, demanded sacrifice, and promised nothing but survival. And in that cold, disciplined silence, Lucky Luciano ruled as both priest and god. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had built the most sophisticated criminal network America had ever seen. But what truly made him extraordinary wasn't just his organizational genius or ruthless efficiency, it was his ability to transform crime itself into a business model. He saw every racket, every illegal scheme, as a potential industry. Under his leadership, vice became enterprise. Crime wasn't chaos anymore, it was commerce. And its profits, unlike those of Wall Street, were tax-free and untraceable. Luciano was no longer the street enforcer or backroom negotiator. He had become a CEO of organized crime, with divisions, managers, and international partnerships. His empire stretched from New York's glittering clubs to Havana's tropical ports, from union halls to the casinos of Las Vegas. Every vice known to man, gambling, liquor, prostitution, narcotics, passed through his invisible hands. But he didn't think like a criminal. He thought like an economist. To him, illegal businesses weren't sins, they were markets. The government had simply abandoned them, and he was just smart enough to take over. Prohibition had ended, but Luciano was prepared for that. Where others panicked at the loss of bootlegging revenue, he pivoted. He diversified. Gambling became his next major frontier, especially in the hotels and clubs of New York and New Jersey. He partnered with Lansky to create organized gambling rings that operated both legally and illegally, each protected by bribes to police and judges. He also saw opportunity in what others considered immoral or taboo. The sex trade, long chaotic and dangerous, became one of his most profitable ventures. Luciano didn't invent prostitution, but he industrialized it. Before him, brothels were run by small-time pimps and madams. He centralized the operation, introducing structure, accounting, and even medical oversight. Prostitutes paid a fixed rate to the syndicate in exchange for safety and clients. Every brothel had a manager, every street had oversight, and every dollar was tracked. He turned the flesh trade into a bureaucratic system that ran with military precision. The newspapers would later call him the King of Vice. But behind that sensational headline was the mind of a man who understood that even sin could be streamlined. Union racketeering became another cornerstone of his empire. Luciano realized that controlling labor meant controlling entire industries. Dock workers, truck drivers, construction crews, none of them moved without the blessing of the syndicate. Through intimidation and negotiation, he gained influence over the International Longshoremen's Association and the Teamsters. Every shipment, every strike, every contract had a hidden tax, a cut that flowed upward to the mafia's coffers. By controlling unions, Luciano didn't just manipulate workers, he controlled cities. He could halt the delivery of goods, stop construction projects, or shut down entire ports. It was power far beyond guns or violence, it was economic control. Yet for all his financial genius, Luciano never lost sight of psychology. He understood that fear was only half of what kept the machine running. The other half was loyalty bought through comfort. His men weren't living in constant terror, they were living well. He paid them fairly, protected their families, and made them feel like shareholders in his empire. Fear kept them in line, but prosperity kept them devoted. It was a delicate equilibrium, one that made betrayal almost unthinkable. He also knew how to make politicians and businessmen complicit without them realizing they were controlled. A loan here, a favor there, a donation to a campaign, an introduction to the right person. Once a man accepted help from Luciano, he was trapped. Debts became chains. The mafia's influence seeped into the very veins of legitimate society. The line between criminal and citizen blurred until it was invisible. Perhaps the most visionary part of Luciano's business of crime was his belief in globalization before the term even existed. He saw opportunity across oceans. Through contacts in Italy, France, and Turkey, he built one of the first transnational drug trafficking systems, focusing on heroin. The drugs were produced overseas, shipped through the Mediterranean, and distributed through New York's ports. The profits were astronomical, but Luciano kept his name distant from the operation. He understood plausible deniability long before corporations perfected it. If something went wrong, intermediaries paid the price, not him. He applied similar principles to the entertainment industry. Nightclubs and casinos became fronts for laundering money. Famous singers, actors, and producers mingled in venues financed by Luciano's network. To the public, they were glamorous hotspots. To the mafia, they were accounting machines. Every ticket sold, every drink poured, was another step in washing dirty money clean. He turned vice into spectacle, corruption into entertainment. But it wasn't just greed driving him, it was obsession with control. Luciano saw the criminal underworld as a reflection of the real world. In both, the same forces ruled: fear, money, and influence. The difference was that in his world, hypocrisy didn't exist. Everyone knew the rules. Every transaction was transparent in its corruption. He often mocked politicians, saying, "We're honest about our business," they're not. Even law enforcement couldn't ignore his genius. Many police officials privately admitted that Luciano's organization was more efficient than their own departments. Arrests were rare, witnesses were non-existent, and evidence evaporated before trials began. His empire functioned like a shadow corporation, decentralized, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. By the late 1930s, Luciano's personal wealth was immense, though most of it couldn't be traced. He lived in luxury apartments, drove expensive cars, and wore custom-made suits. Yet, unlike other gangsters, he avoided flamboyance. He understood that invisibility was safety. He didn't crave fame, he craved continuity. His dream was to institutionalize crime, to make it self-sustaining, generational, and immune to chaos. Still, there was an irony in his success. The same system that made him untouchable also made him indispensable. Every family, every partner, every corrupt politician relied on him to keep order. His empire was too efficient, too profitable. And that made him a target, not just for rivals, but for the government. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey was already watching, building a case piece by piece. The very structure that made Luciano's empire durable would soon be used as evidence of conspiracy. But in that moment, before the walls began to close in, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no man before him had: he had legitimized illegitimacy. He had proven that fear could be monetized, that silence could be systematized, and that crime, when organized like business, could become more stable than law itself. He stood at the peak of power, calm and untouchable, watching the world operate to the rhythm of his design. The city that had once beaten him into the gutter now moved to his commands. Money, influence, loyalty, all bent to his will. And in that quiet dominance, Lucky Luciano believed he had achieved perfection. He had turned sin into structure, vice into value, and fear into an empire. He didn't know it yet, but perfection has a flaw: it invites exposure. And for a man who built his fortune in shadows, the light was coming. Power, once achieved, has a way of breeding both loyalty and rebellion. By the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano sat atop a criminal world more organized than any before it. Yet beneath the polished surface of his empire, cracks began to form. Every man in the underworld wanted a piece of what he had built. Every ally had ambitions, every subordinate had envy, and every rival was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The age of bloody chaos was supposed to be over, but Luciano was beginning to realize that peace was just another illusion, one maintained only by constant vigilance and the silent threat of retribution. Among his closest associates, trust was a fragile currency. Frank Costello, the charming diplomat of the syndicate, handled the political side, bribing judges, negotiating with mayors, and buying protection for the families. He was the face of legitimacy, the man who could make a handshake more powerful than a gunshot. Meyer Lansky, the mathematical genius, handled the books, the laundering, and the offshore networks. Bugsy Siegel was the enforcer, the volatile dreamer who loved the thrill of danger more than money itself. Together they had built something monumental, but unity among ambitious men is temporary. Luciano's first great test of loyalty came from within his own ranks. Vito Genovese, a man both feared and ambitious, began to plot his own ascent. Genovese believed he was destined to inherit the throne, and his impatience grew as Luciano's power expanded. He was brutal, impulsive, and utterly without subtlety, the opposite of Luciano's calm intelligence. Luciano tolerated him because fear alone kept men like Genovese useful. But deep down, he knew that one day, the man's hunger would have to be silenced permanently. While Luciano managed internal ambition, external threats were multiplying. Rival mobsters, once crushed or absorbed during the Commission's formation, began to re-emerge. In Chicago, Al Capone's empire was fracturing under government pressure, and smaller factions were attempting to move eastward. In New York, old loyalties were shifting. The remnants of the Maranzano and Masuria factions still held grudges, whispering that Luciano had betrayed his Sicilian roots. Even in Havana, where Luciano was building connections with the Cuban government and casino owners, whispers of betrayal traveled faster than money. Then there was Dutch Schultz, a volatile and unpredictable gangster who refused to bow to the Commission's authority. Schultz controlled vast rackets in the Bronx and Harlem and made millions through numbers games. But his ambition was dangerous. He wanted to eliminate New York District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, the man who had begun building a reputation by cracking down on organized crime. The commission, led by Luciano, voted against the hit. Killing a prosecutor would bring national attention, something Luciano couldn't afford. Schultz defied the order and plotted the assassination anyway. It was the first time Luciano's leadership would be publicly tested. He couldn't allow defiance to spread. If Schultz ignored him and lived, the entire structure would collapse. So, in 1935, Luciano gave his silent approval for the inevitable. The Murder Incorporated enforcement arm, a network of professional killers overseen by Albert Anastasia and Louis Lepka Buckleter, was activated. One evening in Newark, Dutch Schultz was having dinner when gunmen burst into the restaurant. They shot him multiple times, leaving him mortally wounded. Luciano didn't attend the funeral. He didn't need to. The message was clear: defiance was death. The commission's authority was absolute. But victory came with a price. Schultz's assassination drew the attention of the one man Luciano had hoped to avoid, Thomas E. Dewey himself. The young, relentless prosecutor saw the pattern of violence and corruption spreading across the city and made Luciano his primary target. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: disciplined, idealistic, and utterly incorruptible. Where Luciano manipulated through fear, Dewey inspired through righteousness. Their collision was inevitable. Inside Luciano's empire, paranoia began to grow. Informants, double agents, and ambitious soldiers all saw opportunity in the shifting tides. The FBI and Dewey's investigators started infiltrating Luciano's prostitution rackets, following the money trail that linked brothels to syndicate bookkeepers. The very efficiency of Luciano's business model, the clear hierarchy, the documented transactions, became his vulnerability. Dewey's team began gathering testimony from women and pimps, building a case piece by piece. Meanwhile, old friendships were fraying. Bugsy Siegel's explosive temper was becoming a liability. He wanted his own empire in Hollywood and Las Vegas, spending money faster than it could be counted. Lansky, ever the realist, warned Luciano that Siegel's recklessness could attract unwanted attention. Luciano agreed but refused to betray Siegel, yet. He still believed loyalty was a form of power, even when it became a risk. Frank Costello, on the other hand, was thriving in the political world. He had become the prime minister of the underworld, turning bribes into influence and corruption into policy. But Costello's growing independence also made Luciano uneasy. The organization was becoming too decentralized, too dependent on men who now saw themselves as equals rather than subordinates. Luciano began to feel the invisible erosion of authority, the kind that doesn't come with rebellion but with quiet self-confidence in others. In those years, the underworld mirrored the corporate world above it: alliances, mergers, betrayals, and quiet power plays. Each man maneuvered for influence, masking ambition behind gestures of respect. Luciano's greatest strength had always been his ability to read men, but even he couldn't predict everything. The commission had been designed to prevent all-out war, but it also gave ambitious lieutenants a platform to challenge him under the guise of democracy. What he had built to ensure order was beginning to democratize rebellion. The enemies weren't just external or internal, they were systemic. Luciano's empire had become too perfect, too visible. It ran with such precision that law enforcement could now trace the patterns. Every racket had its ledgers, every family its territory, every payoff its schedule. What had once been invisible now had a rhythm, and rhythm could be tracked. By 1935, Luciano's calm exterior began to mask growing anxiety. For years, he had been the hunter, always 2 steps ahead, always in control. But now he could sense the walls closing in. The alliances that once gave him strength were now binding him in place. The same men who had sworn loyalty to him were beginning to think like him, calculating, patient, ambitious. He was surrounded not by followers, but by reflections of himself. Still, Luciano refused to show weakness. He maintained the same quiet composure, hosting meetings in elegant hotel suites, dining with city officials, and reassuring his associates that business would continue as usual. But behind the scenes, he was fighting to contain the fractures in his empire. He doubled down on bribes, restructured operations, and tried to centralize authority once more. It was a desperate attempt to restore control over a system that had grown beyond him. The enemies he had once conquered were gone, but their ghosts lingered, in the paranoia of his men, in the scrutiny of the press, in the eyes of Dewey's investigators who saw him as the ultimate prize. Luciano had built his empire through unity and fear, but now both forces were turning inward. Fear no longer flowed down from him, it began to flow up toward him. In the grand theater of crime, every king eventually faces betrayal. Luciano knew this, perhaps better than anyone. The difference was that he believed he could manage it. He believed he could predict every move, silence every threat, and outthink every rival. But for the first time, the odds were no longer in his favor. The same discipline that made him untouchable was making him visible, and visibility, in his world, was fatal. As he looked across New York from his penthouse window, the lights of the city flickered like promises, bright, fragile, and fleeting. Somewhere in the distance, Dewey's office glowed with the same light. Two men, two visions of order, two empires on a collision course. The underworld had grown too big to hide, and the man who once ruled through silence would soon find himself surrounded by voices, some whispering loyalty, others betrayal, and one, the voice of the law, that would not stop until it brought him down. By 1936, Lucky Luciano's empire had become so vast, so deeply embedded in the fabric of American life, that it seemed untouchable. He was the invisible king of New York, his presence felt everywhere, his face seen nowhere. Money flowed from every vice in the city into his hands: gambling, narcotics, unions, brothels, and politics. Even the police, who swore to uphold the law, whispered his name with a strange mixture of fear and respect. He had achieved what no gangster before him dared to dream: he ruled without ruling, commanded without speaking, and punished without lifting a hand. But every empire that hides in the shadows eventually leaves footprints. And in Luciano's case, those footprints began leading directly to the courthouse steps. The first cracks appeared not in his business, but in perception. Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious and incorruptible special prosecutor, had made Luciano his target. Dewey wasn't motivated by greed or fear, he was motivated by principle. To him, Luciano represented everything wrong with America's moral decay. The newspapers called Luciano the king of vice, and Dewey made it his personal mission to dethrone him. Unlike the gangsters Luciano had faced before, Dewey didn't play by street rules. He didn't negotiate, didn't bribe, and didn't bluff. He gathered evidence piece by piece, testimony by testimony, until the net began to tighten. Luciano's strength had always been control. But Dewey's investigation attacked the one system Luciano couldn't fully control: the human conscience. Through the prostitution rackets, Dewey's team found witnesses, women who had lived under Luciano's empire of silence but had grown tired of the exploitation. These women, protected by Dewey's office, began to talk. Bit by bit, the sacred code of omerta cracked under the weight of desperation and fear. For the first time, silence was losing its grip. Inside the syndicate, panic spread like infection. Luciano's lieutenants assured him that Dewey's case was weak, that no one would dare testify. But deep down, he knew better. His empire had grown too large, too dependent on too many people. Fear worked perfectly in small circles, but on a citywide scale, it required constant maintenance. Too many soldiers, too many partners, too many mouths. Somewhere, someone was bound to talk. The invisible king was beginning to cast too large a shadow. The newspapers sensationalized the hunt, turning it into a moral crusade. Headlines screamed, "Dewey versus Luciano, the battle for New York's soul." The public was captivated. Housewives, factory workers, and politicians alike followed the story as if it were a serialized drama. For every crime Luciano had orchestrated in silence, Dewey shouted an accusation in the open. And with every headline, Luciano's myth began to crack. The man who once ruled through mystery was now being dragged into the light. Even as the investigation tightened, Luciano tried to maintain his calm. He moved between safe houses, ordered his lawyers to stall proceedings, and relied on his connections in law enforcement to suppress evidence. Yet the very system he had corrupted for years was beginning to betray him. Policemen who had once taken his money now cooperated with Dewey to save themselves. Judges who once dined with him refused his calls. Luciano had spent his life mastering fear, but now, that same fear was turning against him. One night, sitting in his suite at the Waldorf Astoria, Luciano looked out over the skyline he once owned. The lights of Manhattan glimmered like jewels, each one representing a business, a payoff, a promise. He had built a kingdom where loyalty was currency and betrayal was death. But now, loyalty was dissolving under pressure. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and muttered to Costello, "It's funny, Frank, when you own everything, you don't really own anyone." It was perhaps the first time he admitted defeat, not publicly, but to himself. The pressure didn't just come from law enforcement. Inside his own organization, uncertainty was spreading. Vito Genovese, always hungry for power, began quietly positioning himself as Luciano's successor. Lansky and Costello tried to hold the structure together, reassuring everyone that the boss was untouchable. But the commission, the very system Luciano had created to prevent chaos, began to question whether his leadership had become a liability. The unity he'd built through logic was now unraveling through fear. The streets buzzed with rumor: Luciano would flee the country, Luciano would bribe Dewey, Luciano would eliminate witnesses. Each rumor chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. The king of vice was no longer invisible, he was hunted prey. And yet, even under siege, Luciano refused to lash out blindly. He was too disciplined for that. Instead, he waited. He told his men, "If they want a war, we'll give them patience. Let them come close. Let them believe I'm trapped." But patience, like power, had limits. Dewey's investigation finally delivered the blow. In February 1936, detectives raided brothels across New York, arresting over 100 prostitutes and madams connected to Luciano's network. The evidence was undeniable. Books, ledgers, payment slips, all led back to his lieutenants. Dewey's prosecutors began building a conspiracy case, arguing that Luciano was the unseen boss of an organized system of prostitution and corruption. It was the first time in American history that a criminal case aimed not at individual crimes but at an entire criminal infrastructure. When the news broke, the underworld trembled. Luciano had always been careful to keep his name off paper, his orders unspoken. But now, words, sworn testimonies, became more dangerous than bullets. Dewey's courtroom became a theater of psychological warfare. The witnesses weren't hardened gangsters but ordinary women, some trembling, some defiant, all willing to describe in excruciating detail how Luciano's empire had profited from their bodies and silence. The moral narrative was powerful. The public saw not a businessman, but a predator. Luciano's calm demeanor during this period was almost eerie. Even as his men were arrested, even as his name filled the headlines, he continued to act as if nothing was wrong. He dressed impeccably, attended meetings, and smiled for photographers. "You can't fear the storm," he told a reporter, "if you are the one who made the weather." It was bravado, of course, but it was also truth. The storm that was now destroying him was one he had created, fed, and controlled for years. In private, however, his mind was restless. He began to see patterns in his own downfall. The same tactics he had used to dismantle his enemies were now being used against him. Dewey had created his own kind of commission, a network of prosecutors, witnesses, and police officers, all unified under one goal. Luciano recognized it instantly. "He's playing my game," he said once to Lansky, half amused, half enraged. "The son of a bitch learned from me." By the time Dewey's team issued the arrest warrant, Luciano knew there was no escape. The same structure that had made his empire efficient had also made it traceable. His brilliance, his obsession with organization, had become his downfall. On April 1, 1936, he was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, while trying to avoid extradition. The king of vice, the man who once controlled New York from the shadows, was now being led away in handcuffs. The press swarmed, the cameras flashed, and for the first time, Lucky Luciano's silence couldn't protect him. Yet even then, there was no panic in his eyes. To the reporters shouting his name, he smirked and said, "They can arrest me, but they can't arrest what I built." And in that moment, he wasn't wrong. His body might have been in chains, but his empire, the networks, the systems, the psychology of fear, still pulsed beneath the city streets. The hidden war between Luciano and Dewey wasn't fought with bullets, but with ideals. Dewey believed in law, Luciano believed in order. Both were right in their own way. But in a world where fear ruled longer than justice, Luciano's order was about to face its greatest test. The invisible king had been dragged into the light, and now, the world would see whether an empire built on silence could survive the noise of truth. The arrest of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was more than a police victory, it was a symbolic moment, the day America declared war on the invisible empire that had ruled its streets for a decade. For years, Luciano had been a ghost in the machinery of crime, a man who commanded everything yet could never be touched. But now, the walls were closing in. His empire, once unshakable, was beginning to fracture under pressure. The fall didn't happen all at once, it was a slow, deliberate unraveling, the kind that strips away not just power, but identity. When he was first brought into custody, Luciano treated it as theater. He arrived in court impeccably dressed, his hair slicked back, his expression calm, even amused. The press cameras flashed like lightning, and he met them with a smirk that said, "You think this is the end?" For the first time, the man who had built an empire from fear was surrounded not by lieutenants and allies, but by reporters and prosecutors. To the public, he still looked untouchable. But inside, he knew the truth: fear works only when it flows outward, never when it begins to turn back toward its creator. Thomas E. Dewey's prosecution team was relentless. They had gathered over 200 witnesses, built a timeline of transactions, and traced the money through a labyrinth of brothels, safe houses, and shell companies. Luciano's own brilliance, the organization, the ledgers, the hierarchies, had made their job easier. The system he had perfected to control others now stood as evidence against him. Every signature, every coded message, every bribe had become a link in the chain pulling him toward conviction. Behind the scenes, Luciano's allies scrambled to contain the damage. Frank Costello met quietly with politicians, offering bribes and favors that once would have been irresistible. Meyer Lansky worked feverishly to relocate assets, ensuring the money would remain safe if Luciano fell. But it was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. The government wasn't after his fortune, it was after his influence. Dewey understood that destroying Luciano's empire wasn't about arresting a man, it was about dismantling a myth. Still, Luciano refused to show weakness. Even from his jail cell, he maintained control over his organization. Messages were smuggled out through lawyers, visitors, and coded notes. Orders still came from him, though his reach was shrinking. To his men, he was still the boss. But the old fear that kept them obedient was starting to erode. Without his physical presence, his voice, his gaze, his unpredictable calm, the spell began to weaken. The new generation of gangsters, younger and more impatient, saw his absence as an opportunity. Men like Genovese and Anastasia were already circling, pretending loyalty while plotting inheritance. The press called him the Lord High Executioner of Vice. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, socialites, and curious onlookers. The nation was divided, some saw Dewey as a hero cleansing society of corruption, others saw Luciano as a product of that same society's hypocrisy. For every sermon preached about morality, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that Luciano's world had only thrived because it reflected the greed and weakness of the legitimate one. Dewey's evidence was strong, but his true weapon was narrative. He didn't just accuse Luciano of running a prostitution ring, he portrayed him as a symbol of moral decay, a man who treated human beings like currency. In court, one witness after another described how Luciano's lieutenants collected money from brothels, how fear kept women silent, how every dollar they made found its way back to the syndicate. For the first time, the psychological empire of fear was translated into legal terms: conspiracy, coercion, corruption. Luciano's lawyers fought back with everything they had. They painted him as a scapegoat, arguing that he was a successful gambler and businessman, not a criminal overlord. They claimed Dewey was using him to build a political career. They pointed out that no witness could directly tie him to orders or payments. And technically, that was true. Luciano never wrote anything down, never gave orders openly. But Dewey didn't need a confession. He only needed a pattern, and that pattern was undeniable. The trial lasted weeks. Each day, Luciano sat silently, occasionally leaning toward his attorneys, never losing his composure. To the jurors, his calm looked like arrogance. To his allies, it looked like control. But inside, he was analyzing every witness, every piece of evidence, every shift in the courtroom's energy. He had built his life on reading people, and now he was surrounded by them, the ambitious prosecutor, the nervous jurors, the fearful witnesses. For the first time, he couldn't manipulate the outcome. The courtroom was a stage he didn't control. Outside the courthouse, New York itself was changing. The streets once ruled by Luciano's soldiers were now filled with police raids, shuttered brothels, and frightened businessmen cutting ties with the underworld. The commission tried to maintain calm, but the center of gravity was shifting. Without Luciano's authority, disagreements turned into quiet wars. Territories were contested, money went missing, and alliances fractured. It was as if the invisible architecture of the underworld was collapsing from the top down. In June 1936, the verdict came. Guilty, on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The judge sentenced Luciano to 30 to 50 years in prison, the harshest penalty ever given to an organized crime figure in the United States. Dewey had done what no one thought possible, he had caged the most powerful man in the American underworld. The press celebrated, the public applauded, and Luciano, for the first time in his life, felt the weight of defeat. As he was led out of the courtroom, handcuffed and surrounded by guards, reporters shouted questions. One asked if he regretted anything. Luciano smiled faintly and said, "Only that I didn't charge admission." The courtroom erupted in laughter, but behind that humor was bitterness. It was a final act of defiance, a refusal to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Yet beneath the surface, something inside him had changed. For a man who built his life around control, losing it was worse than death. In prison, the transformation was brutal. Gone were the tailored suits, the fine cigars, the constant flow of cash. He was now inmate number 92168, locked in a concrete cell at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a place known as Little Siberia, for its freezing temperatures and isolation. He was surrounded by murderers, thieves, and broken men. The silence he once commanded was replaced by the clanging of iron doors. The king of the underworld had become a ghost in a cage. Still, even behind bars, Luciano refused to disappear. He used his charisma, his intelligence, and his natural command to win the respect of both inmates and guards. Within months, he had recreated a version of his empire inside prison walls, organizing gambling rings, managing contraband, and mediating disputes. Fear still worked, even in confinement. The difference was that now it was his shield, not his weapon. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow descent from myth to man. In the beginning, he believed he could outthink fate, that intelligence and order could conquer chaos. But now he saw the truth, every empire built on fear eventually consumes itself. The same silence that had protected him had also hidden his enemies. The same discipline that made him powerful had made him predictable. As he lay on his cot at night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, Luciano often wondered if this was his true punishment, not the prison walls, but the loss of invisibility. The world knew his name now. The mystery was gone, the legend exposed. Power, once his armor, had become his prison. And somewhere deep inside, perhaps for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano began to question whether the empire he had built had ever truly belonged to him, or if it had always belonged to fear itself. The trial of Charles Lucky Luciano in 1936 was unlike anything the American public had ever seen. It wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a moral spectacle, a battle between two visions of power, one born in the alleys, the other in the law. The newspapers turned it into daily theater. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered for a glimpse of the man who had supposedly ruled New York sin from the shadows. Inside, under the glow of the chandeliers, a different kind of war was being fought, not with bullets, but with words, with psychology, with the slow dissection of a man who had built his empire on silence. Luciano entered the courtroom each morning as if it were a boardroom. His suits were immaculate, his expression unreadable. He made small talk with his attorneys, even smiled occasionally at the jurors. It was a performance of composure. To the untrained eye, he looked confident, even relaxed. But those who knew him best could see it, the flicker behind his eyes, the constant calculation. Every question, every witness, every gesture from Dewey was measured, analyzed, catalogued. He was still playing the game, even as the rules were changing against him. Dewey, for his part, was meticulous. He wasn't just prosecuting a man, he was prosecuting an idea. His case wasn't built on one crime, but on a pattern of corruption. He painted Luciano as the spider at the center of an invisible web, connecting every act of vice and violence across the city. His voice, calm and precise, carried a kind of righteousness that resonated with jurors. He spoke of morality, of civic duty, of the need to restore order. He presented his evidence like an accountant presenting a balance sheet, numbers, names, dates, witnesses. Methodical. Inevitable. The first days of testimony were electric. Dewey's witnesses, madams, prostitutes, and small-time gangsters, were nervous, trembling under the weight of their own fear. Many had lived their lives under the iron rule of Luciano's organization. Their silence had once been guaranteed by threats that stretched from the gutter to City Hall. Now they were speaking aloud in public, under oath, protected by the full power of the state. For Luciano, each word was an act of betrayal, not because it endangered him, but because it shattered the illusion he had spent years crafting. His empire had always been built on the belief that silence was unbreakable. Now, one by one, that silence was cracking like glass. One witness, a madam named Cokie Flo Brown, became the prosecution's centerpiece. She spoke of the network of brothels, of the money that flowed upward to Luciano's lieutenants, of the fear that kept everyone obedient. Her testimony was vivid, emotional, and devastating. She described the system in the language of survival: men who collected payments with polite smiles, women who knew that disobedience meant disappearance, and a boss whose name was rarely spoken but always understood. "We never saw him," she said softly, "but we all knew he was there." That single sentence captured the essence of Luciano's empire. Luciano's defense team countered with disdain. They called the witnesses liars, opportunists, people corrupted by their own greed. They claimed Dewey had manipulated desperate women into testifying with promises of leniency and safety. They argued that there was no direct evidence, no signature, no eyewitness linking Luciano to the crimes. And in truth, they weren't wrong. Luciano had always been careful, methodical, invisible. He had built walls of intermediaries so thick that no one could reach him. But Dewey didn't need to reach him physically. He needed to reach him morally. The prosecution framed the case as a test of America's soul. Could a nation built on law tolerate a man who built his own empire above it? Could a society that worshipped wealth ignore the way that wealth was made? Dewey turned the trial into a parable of corruption, ambition, and decay. The newspapers devoured it. Headlines called it the trial of the century. Photographs of Luciano's calm, polished face ran beside images of tearful witnesses. To the public, he had become both villain and fascination, a devil in a tailored suit. Behind the scenes, Luciano remained eerily calm. He knew anger was weakness, emotion was exposure. He whispered to his lawyers, took notes, and occasionally smiled at the prosecutor's remarks. He seemed to enjoy the performance. When reporters asked him during recess if he thought he'd win, he replied, "I never lose. Sometimes I just wait longer." It was bravado, but it was also philosophy. Luciano didn't believe in defeat, only in temporary setbacks. But privately, the cracks were deepening. From his holding cell, he received reports from the outside world. The commission was struggling to maintain order. Genovese was maneuvering, whispering about taking over the business if Luciano went down. Some allies had vanished altogether. Even Lansky, his closest friend, was silent. Luciano was too pragmatic to feel betrayed, he simply understood that fear only travels one way. Once he was removed from power, it no longer radiated outward, it dispersed. As the trial dragged on, Dewey built his case piece by piece, constructing an architecture of guilt that even Luciano had to admire. The prosecutor's genius lay not in uncovering hidden documents or secret recordings, but in understanding the psychology of power. Dewey knew that Luciano's empire was not built on crime alone, it was built on myth. To destroy the man, he had to destroy the myth. Each witness, each exhibit, each word stripped away another layer of legend. By the time Dewey rested his case, the king of the underworld had been reduced to a businessman of sin, his empire nothing more than an elaborate racket. The defense's closing arguments were passionate but futile. They appealed to logic, to the absence of hard proof, to the reasonable doubt that should have protected their client. But the jury wasn't judging evidence, they were judging aura. They saw in Dewey's moral clarity the possibility of redemption, and in Luciano's composure, the embodiment of guilt. The trial had become theater, and in theater, truth often yields to symbolism. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Luciano barely blinked. The judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but Luciano remained motionless, staring straight ahead. He knew better than anyone that emotion was vulnerability. When reporters swarmed him afterward, he shrugged and said with a faint grin, "There's worse places to do business." It was his final act of control, to make defeat sound like strategy. The trial marked more than his personal downfall, it was a turning point in American history. For the first time, organized crime had been defined, mapped, and prosecuted as an institution. Dewey's victory didn't just imprison a man, it redefined the enemy. The mafia was no longer folklore, it was fact. And Lucky Luciano, whether he admitted it or not, had become its face. As he was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, flashes from the cameras illuminated his path like gunfire. For years, he had ruled from the shadows, now, he walked through blinding light. He paused at the steps, looked back once at the courthouse, the arena where his power had died, and muttered, "They'll need me again." It wasn't arrogance. It was prophecy. Luciano's trial wasn't the end of his story. It was the first act of his transformation. Because in that moment, as the world celebrated his downfall, he understood something no one else did: power doesn't vanish when a man is caged. It waits. It adapts. It hides. And for a man who had built an empire from fear, confinement wasn't punishment, it was incubation. The empire might be wounded, the myth might be cracked, but Lucky Luciano was still breathing. And as long as he breathed, the world he created would never truly die. Prison was meant to end Lucky Luciano's empire, but instead it became his classroom, his mirror, and, in time, his new throne. Clinton Correctional Facility, cold, isolated, and merciless, was known for breaking spirits. Yet the man who had ruled through silence understood confinement better than most. Walls could contain a body, not a mind. From the moment he arrived, Luciano observed the system the way a general studies terrain. He treated guards, inmates, and administrators as moving pieces on a board. Within weeks, he was mediating disputes, brokering trades, and quietly organizing gambling rings. Cigarettes became currency, favors became investment. He restored order in a place built for chaos. Even the warden admitted that discipline improved under Luciano's invisible management. He didn't rule through intimidation now, but through understanding. He learned the guards' weaknesses, the inmates' needs, and used both to maintain control. A loan here, a gift there, a whispered promise of opportunity once they were released, he made loyalty habitual, not forced. Fear had turned to respect, and respect turned back into influence. The empire had shrunk to a few cell blocks, but its principles remained the same. Isolation also forced reflection. For the first time since childhood, Luciano had nothing to organize but his own thoughts. Nights in the freezing dark brought questions he had long ignored: had he created power, or merely borrowed it? Had fear kept men loyal, or simply enslaved them all, himself included? Yet self-doubt never became remorse. He still believed in the order he'd built, he only wondered if it could exist without him. Outside, his lieutenants kept the machine alive. Frank Costello managed the political networks, Meyer Lansky handled the finances, and Vito Genovese schemed in the shadows. Messages traveled through lawyers and coded letters, garden metaphors, weather updates, phrases only he could decode. Even locked away, Luciano's voice guided the syndicate. His reach had limits, but his legend still enforced obedience. Then came World War II, and with it, the strange twist of fate that would redeem his name. In 1942, a fire destroyed the troopship Normandy in New York Harbor, fueling panic about Axis sabotage. The Navy needed control of the docks, and the only man who still had it was locked behind bars. Through intermediaries, naval intelligence approached Luciano, proposing a covert arrangement later known as Operation Underworld. He would ensure Union cooperation, stop sabotage, and quietly police the waterfront in exchange for leniency. It was irony worthy of scripture: the U.S. government, in its hour of fear, turned to the architect of fear himself. Luciano accepted without hesitation. "Business is business," he reportedly said. Under his direction, Mafia dockworkers tightened security, and the attacks stopped. The government never acknowledged the full extent of his help, but intelligence officers privately admitted that after Luciano's involvement, the harbor stayed clear. The arrangement changed his reputation. To his enemies, he was still a criminal; to his admirers, a patriot in disguise. Most of all, it reminded the world that even in chains, Luciano could make himself indispensable. Power, he had learned, wasn't about freedom, it was about relevance. By 1945, influential officials began lobbying for his release. Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the same man who had destroyed him a decade earlier, approved a commutation of his sentence on the condition of deportation to Italy. The irony was perfect: prosecutor and prisoner, bound again by pragmatism. On February 2, 1946, Luciano walked out of Clinton prison a free man, thinner, grayer, but unbroken. Reporters crowded the gates, shouting questions. He smiled faintly and said, "You can't keep a good businessman down." Then he boarded the ship that would take him home, not in defeat, but in transformation. For nearly 10 years, Luciano had ruled from behind walls. In that frozen isolation, he learned the ultimate truth of power: it needs no throne, no empire, no territory. It only needs belief. And as long as men still feared, respected, or remembered him, Lucky Luciano would never truly be imprisoned again. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, the Atlantic crossing felt like an elegy. The ocean that had once carried him to opportunity was now returning him to solitude. Italy welcomed him with suspicion and fascination, the American Godfather under constant surveillance. Yet Luciano, older and reflective, had no appetite for rebuilding empires. Power had exhausted him; what remained was the shadow of it. He settled in Naples, living quietly but never forgotten. The local underworld sought his counsel, and governments occasionally used his influence during the Cold War. He played the role of the retired king, still sharp, still feared, but distant. Visitors came seeking wisdom, and Luciano offered philosophy instead of commands: power isn't about owning people, it's about making them believe they need you. He lived surrounded by the ghosts of his past, friends gone, allies turned enemies. The empire still followed his blueprint, from New York to Havana, but it no longer belonged to him. He spent his final years in quiet reflection, watching the sea and smoking endlessly, as if waiting for something that would never return. In January 1962, during a meeting with a film producer who wanted to dramatize his life, Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack at Naples airport. He died instantly: no bullets, no betrayal, just silence. His body was returned to New York, buried among the city's noise he once ruled. The king who built his throne on fear left the world quietly, finally beyond control, finally at peace. Beneath Luciano's legend lay a cold brilliance, the mind of a strategist who studied men as mechanisms. He understood that power was not sustained by violence, but by perception. To control others, one must first understand their fears, desires, and dependencies. He mastered empathy not as compassion, but as leverage. He never relied on chaos, he organized it. His genius was structural, building order where others saw crime. Every murder, alliance, and favor fit into a calculated system. He turned the mafia into a corporation of emotion, fear as currency, silence as law. His leadership was psychological, not theatrical. Men followed him because he made them feel predictable under his rule. Luciano's charm was his greatest weapon. He disarmed men with warmth, then bound them with logic. To him, loyalty was a transaction, betrayal, a cost of business. Never hate, he told his lieutenants. Hate makes noise. Silence lasts longer. That was his creed: control emotion, command outcome. Yet beneath the precision was a haunting emptiness. Years of control had isolated him. He couldn't trust love, friendship, or faith, only systems. His intellect had outgrown his humanity. In old age, he admitted, we all pay for the things we build. Some just pay later. Psychologists later called him a sociopath. Perhaps, but Luciano was also a philosopher of power. He turned manipulation into art and influence into science. His tragedy wasn't his crimes, it was that he understood people too well to ever truly belong among them. Lucky Luciano's death didn't end his influence, it crystallized it. He didn't just shape organized crime, he shaped how the world understands power. His system of hierarchy, loyalty, and silence outlived him, seeping into corporations, politics, and intelligence networks. Before Luciano, crime was chaos. After him, it was structure. He transformed violence into management, fear into policy. His commission became the model for decentralized control, what modern leaders would later call organization. The mafia mirrored capitalism, Luciano simply removed its moral disguise. He proved that the most powerful weapon wasn't fear itself, but belief in it. His methods reappeared everywhere: quiet boardrooms, secret alliances, corrupt institutions. Wherever people obey without question, his ghost lingers. Hollywood turned him into myth, the calm, brilliant Don. But beyond the fiction, his real legacy is darker. He was the first to show that corruption could wear a suit, that evil could be efficient, and that fear could be civilized. Luciano's philosophy still resonates: power thrives in silence, loyalty is currency, and control is an illusion one must constantly rebuild. He had conquered the mechanics of humanity, only to lose his own soul in the process. He once said, "Fear is just another kind of faith." That sentence became his epitaph: chilling, timeless, true. Because Lucky Luciano didn't just build an empire of fear. He built the blueprint for every system that survives on it. And the world, knowingly or not, still lives by his design.